Hello everyone! Thanks so much for tuning into another episode of Ghost Story Cafe. In today's episode, we are going to be talking about fairy folk. So when it comes to fairies, there are lots of different interpretations of what they could be, lots of different interpretations of what they could look like and what they are like. So we're going to be looking at a few of those different examples today and discussing them a little bit more. I've always been really fascinated with the idea of fairies. I remember that I always really enjoyed a book that was called Lady Coddington's Book of Pressed Fairies when I was growing up, and that was something that always really inspired my love of fairies. So I was really excited to dive into the topic a little bit more with you guys today. As you know, through this podcast series, I'm always looking into some different topics about the supernatural. And through this experience, I'm always trying to learn a little bit more about these topics. So what exactly are fairies? Across different cultures, there's different ideas as to what they could be, but it seemed like in the research I had done, a lot of people agreed that fairies could potentially be nature spirits. And of course, it seemed like across different cultures, they all had different interpretations and different folklore and stories about fairies. Of course, everybody has their own ideas and thoughts about different supernatural things like this. A lot of people raise the question, are fairies real? And I guess that's something that we don't really know for sure. One of the earlier examples, I guess, that people had when they were talking about fairies was actually stemmed from a picture that was taken. I'm not exactly 100% sure when this picture was taken. I'd have to probably check to see what year this was, but it's usually referred to as the Codingly Fairies. Now, in this instance, there was a family and they decided that they were going to go outside and take some photos together. Now, when the father had developed the film photos, it looked like the children in the pictures, their daughters, it looked like they had fairies with them in the photographs. So for a very long time, people believed that that was evidence that fairies existed. At that time, they believed that the photographs were real. Of course, years later, people did take a look back at those photos and question whether or not they were authentic. When I was reading up a little bit more about the Codingly Fairies, there was someone who later on debunked the photos. Early on, they did have the pictures of the fairies kind of imposed over top of the original photographs, but for a very long time, people believed that that was actual proof of fairies. So I thought that that was something interesting. Maybe you have heard of the Codingly Fairies before. It's very interesting to look back at the photos, and I think that the original Codingly Fairies kind of inspired the book Lady Coddington's Pressed Fairy Book with illustrations by Brian Froud. So it's kind of a big question as to whether or not fairies are real. A lot of people probably have different beliefs on this, but we'll look at some of the different examples of fairies throughout different cultures and we'll kind of go from there. So the first type of fairy or fairy creature that I wanted to chat about today was something called brownies. It is believed that brownies originated in Scotland, this type of fairy. In a lot of the writings, people believe that these brownies, these fairy creatures, might have come to America and Canada with the Scottish immigrants. So brownies are described as being male, elf-like creatures. They tend to dwell in the home, and usually they like to stay in like warm nooks and crannies. They're described as being very helpful fairy folk. So usually they'll help out with different chores, they'll help with cleaning. In the older legends, people have said that when the wife of the house would go to sleep at night, that the brownies, these fairies, would actually help with all the different chores and the different cleaning. So definitely not a bad fairy for sure to have in your house. I would not mind having a brownie helping me with my cleaning and my chores. As long as they were treated respectfully and treated kindly, the brownies were very helpful creatures. It is said that for people that lived on farms and had farms, that sometimes the brownies would even help with their different chores around the farm and would help out. So as you've probably heard of, if you live on a farm, the rooster crows in the morning to wake everybody up. Well, the legend of the brownie goes that when the rooster crows in the morning, it's actually crowing to let the brownie spirits or the brownie fairies know that it's time to go to bed, so that way they might not be seen or discovered by humans. I thought that that was kind of interesting. I've never ever heard that before, so that was pretty cool. Another thing that was interesting about the brownies is that it's said that if you give them an article of clothing, that they will take it and they will leave. So in the article that I was reading online, they said that a lot of people might kind of recognize that or think that it sounds familiar. And immediately you would think about Dobby the house elf from the Harry Potter series. So there's kind of a cool connection there between the folklore of the brownies and how it kind of ties in with Harry Potter and Dobby the house elf. So usually in all of the stories about brownies, they tend to bring good luck to anybody that they're around, and they also can help by warding off evil spirits. Another form of fairy creature or elves that have originated in Scotland is something called hobgoblins. The name sounds really funny, but this type of creature actually ties in really closely with the brownies. So apparently, if the brownies, they're not treated nicely and they're not treated respectfully, brownies can become what we call hobgoblins. So when this takes place, instead of helping around the house, they kind of cause havoc and chaos. They'll start to tear the house apart. It's even said that sometimes they'll take your food out of your cupboards and they'll take things away from you. So, whether you believe it or not, they say that brownies usually tend to be good and helpful spirits, but if you're not kind to them, they can kind of cause a lot of problems for you. So in Canada and also the United States, people have also reported seeing green elves, which they believe is like a form of fairy, and also pixies, so I'll talk a little bit about them. So the green elf creatures, of course, they're usually described as being green in color. They're usually pretty short, they're quite tiny. Usually they're male, and they tend to also live in trees. Most often, these forms of fairy creatures are seen at the forest edge. They're always outside in nature, and I think they kind of can be camouflaged in the forest as well. They're also sometimes seen in graveyards as well. As far as the pixie creatures go, you can probably kind of have a picture in your mind of what they might look like. Pixies have been depicted a lot in different fairy tales and stories that you might be familiar with. So usually these pixies are described as being winged, tiny human-like beings. Usually they have really pretty wings, and of course they usually have pointed ears. So people have also reported having experiences seeing pixies, and if they look really closely, they've even seen these green elves. So I thought that that was pretty interesting. I certainly haven't seen or experienced anything like that myself, but it was kind of cool to learn a little bit more of the origins of some of these fairy creatures. The next one I thought was pretty interesting, and this comes from a belief of fairies, which is from the Cherokee tribe. So the Cherokee tribe, they believed in 3 different types of fairy-like creatures, and each of them had different characteristics and different behaviors that they learned after a while. Sometimes they've also been referred to as Yanwi Onsti, which translates in English to little people. So I'll kind of describe the three different types of fairy folk that they had interactions with. So the first type of fairy is what they have referred to as the rock people. So usually they are described as being territorial. They didn't really like it, if people came too close to where they were living. They like to stay hidden and keep to themselves. So if people became too close to the rock people or to their houses, they would sometimes throw rocks at them and do different things like that to try to scare them away. The second type of fairy was the Laurel People. Now these ones, I thought that they kind of sounded a little bit similar to pixies and how they can be kind of like mischievous. So the Laurel People, the Cherokee described as being very mischievous kind of fairies. They tended to be pranksters, so they would kind of pull like practical jokes and do things to kind of trick people. The third type of fairy that the Cherokee encountered were called the Dogwood People. So these types of fairies, they described as being like healers. So they would make efforts to try to help people. They were very helpful creatures. I thought that it was really interesting to read some of the stories about the encounters people have had with these types of fairies. One area, one culture where fairies are really valued and they've been a large part of the culture is actually in Iceland. So people in Iceland for many generations have talked about a kind of mythical being, a type of fairy that they describe as the Huldufolk. And this just is translated in English to the hidden people. So for many years, they believe that the Huldufolk, that they have lived in large rocks. Usually these are volcanic rocks, and they can usually be found in fields and along beaches. So it's a big thing in the Icelandic culture that if you see any of these rocks, it's very important not to disturb them because it's possible that the Huldufolk could be living there. So they have been described as very tiny human-like beings or spirits. They're really treasured in this culture because it is thought that sometimes they come out to help and protect people in Iceland. It's very interesting because in a lot of the stories, people describe the Huldufolk as being very similar to people. So the Huldufolk, they have families of their own, they work and look for food and different things like that. So I thought that was kind of interesting to read about. So as I said, these rocks where the Huldufolk are said to live, it's very important that people don't bother them or disrespect them. And there was one story I was reading. It was about a girl, and she was growing up originally from Iceland. And her and a group of friends one day decided that they were going to go walking around some of these volcanic rocks. She found one in the field, and it was really big, like this huge volcanic rock, and she decided that she wanted to try to climb onto the top of it, maybe to see if she could find any of the Huldufolk there. Her friends said, that's really not a good idea. We don't think you should do it. But she decided that she was going to climb up on top of the rock anyway. So she said that she had to work really hard to get up there because it was really tall, but she eventually made it to the top. And she said that she was up there for a few moments, didn't really see anything, and as she was jumping down from the rock, all of a sudden she bit the inside of her cheek. And she said that, she was bleeding at the time, and it seemed like it happened so fast. So because of the Huldufolk and the different legends about them, she was afraid that maybe it happened because she had disrespected the fairies that were there. So it's kind of interesting to see how the culture is so influenced by the belief of fairies and the Huldufolk in Iceland. I know when I was reading about this, one of the first things that I thought about was a movie that came out, I think just a couple years ago, and it's called Eurovision. Will Ferrell is in it, and in that movie, the characters are from Iceland, and they do kind of make a reference to the Huldufólk and the fairy culture in Iceland. So I thought about that right away and thought that that was kind of interesting. Another thing I thought was kind of interesting about the Huldufólk in the Icelandic culture was that they kind of talk about them as just being, like ordinary, like having families, kind of living ordinary lives like these mythical creatures. It wasn't, like described as being super magical or anything like that. So I thought that that was kind of cool to read about too. Also, something else I was reading just to show like how important the Huldufólk are in Iceland. I think it was that they were deciding whether or not to build a highway or this road through a part of Iceland. And in this particular area, there was a lot of the volcanic rock where it's said that the fairy spirits live. Because of this, a lot of people were petitioning against having the road put there because they were afraid of causing any damage or disrespecting the Huldufólk that could live there. So I'm not sure if like how much it influenced whether or not they did build the road. I'd have to find out a little bit more, but it just goes to show how important it is to them and how much they truly do believe in that story and these fairies. So I also have a couple of fairy stories to share with you guys today. It's cool to kind of, learn about the background and some of the different theories and ideas about fairies, but it's always fun to kind of hear stories from people that claim to have had kind of real experiences with these beings and with these kind of supernatural things. So I found two really good stories and I'll share them with you today. So the first story, this actually came from 1937, and this story comes from the actually an investigative society that was completely focused on fairies in England. So the Fairy Investigation Society, this year they had gotten a letter from a woman, and in this letter she was writing about a really strange, bizarre experience that she had. She said that it was with a strange kind of winged creature, and this happened in Gloucestershire, England. I really hope that I pronounced that right. So at the time, the woman said in the letter that she was staying at this old house. In the back, it had this really big, beautiful garden, and it led out to the forest. In the afternoon, she said that she liked to sit outside in the garden, and one day she had washed her hair. She decided that she was going to sit outside in the garden to dry her hair out. It was a beautiful sunny day. As she was sitting there, kind of enjoying the sunshine and the beautiful weather, she said that she felt something tugging in her hair, and it really surprised her. She decided she was going to check and see what the matter was, and she was really shocked by what she saw. She said that she saw a small, wrinkled, green man with human-like features, and he was all tangled up in her hair. In a squeaky, irritated voice, he said,
"You have no right to be here."
And within a few minutes, he freed himself, and he completely disappeared. So that was kind of a story that had come out back in the 1930s. This woman said and claimed that she had kind of that weird experience with what she thought could have been a type of fairy. So I thought that that was kind of cool to read about. I'm not sure, what would you do in a situation like that? I feel like I would be pretty scared, especially because the fairy seemed not happy and pretty ticked off. So I think that that would be weird, and I really couldn't imagine experiencing something like that. Do you guys believe that it could have been a real fairy? And if not, what do you think it could have been? I especially think that it's really strange and unusual because it happened at a time when she really wasn't expecting anything strange to happen. She was just sitting outside enjoying the day. So I wonder too what the Fairy Society thought about that letter when she sent it in back in the 1930s. Very cool to read about and kind of cool to think about. The second fairy story, this came out I guess that this story was from 2005. So a man and his girlfriend, they decided that they were going to go stay with some friends in Pennsylvania for a few days. And their friends were living in this house. It was a little bit remote and it had like this beautiful forest behind the house. It was kind of set back in the woods a little bit. So they spent most of the day kind of sitting outside on their back porch, enjoying the afternoon, enjoying the weather. And they ended up staying out there talking late into the evening and enjoying the night. All of a sudden, they said that they heard this weird sound coming from these potted plants over on the side of the porch. They didn't really think too much of it at first. We're still kind of just listening to the sound that they were hearing, trying to figure out what it could be. And all of a sudden, they said that they saw this kind of tiny creature come up from behind the pots. And this is what it looked like. They described it as being a tiny, female, human-like creature, and it flew up into the air. They described her as having a very greenish glow. She had translucent wings, and they said that it looked a lot almost like butterfly wings. One of the things that I thought was really creepy about that story was that they said it looked like she had veins on her wings and they could make it out really distinctly. So they thought that is super creepy and they were just really freaked out by the whole scenario. After a few moments of seeing her, they said that she darted very quickly into the darkness, into the forest, and that was it. They were just kind of left there speechless, looking at one another and trying to process what they had just seen. Although everyone was really startled by the experience and trying to make sense of everything, they all looked at each other and they all agreed they were thinking the same thing, that what they saw was probably a fairy. It's definitely fun and interesting to think that they could have experienced something like that. Yeah, it's hard to say. I thought that was a really interesting story. I really like that one a lot. What would you guys do if you were sitting outside and that happened? I feel like I'd probably be in a similar situation to those people. I'd probably be pretty stunned and not be able to kind of process what I was seeing. So, yeah. I think that they handled that situation pretty well considering everything. I also thought it was really cool how they described in that story the really small details that they could make out about this fairy-like creature, down to the fact that she had a female-like figure, that they could make out the details in her wings. I really was fascinated by that one. And I'm not sure what you guys would think. Of course, everybody has their own different beliefs and opinions about it, but it was a really fun story to read. So another thing that you might be thinking is, well, if fairies do exist, how do you know if there could be one around you? What are some of the signs that maybe you could have a presence of a fairy in your home, around your house? I was able to find a couple of different signs and some different details that could maybe help you figure out if you do have a fairy nearby. And here are some of the different signs. So the first one that came up was that a possible sign of a fairy being near is that you suddenly get a smell of something sweet. Fairies really tend to enjoy, they say, sweet things. So any aroma like flowers, honey, berries, strawberries, they say that suddenly smelling something sweet like that could be a sign that you have a fairy nearby. The next possible sign of a fairy is that you might feel a tickle on your cheek. So some people have said that if you do feel that little tickle, that it could be a fairy giving you a kiss on the cheek. People have also said that if you have flowers growing around your home, when you haven't planted any, that could also be a sign that you may have fairies around your home. So I guess I read that they especially tend to like dandelions and definitely dandelions they really love. So if you have a lot of dandelions around your home, that could be a sign that maybe you have some fairies close by. This one I thought was really interesting and kind of got me thinking a little bit more was some people believe that your pet's reacting to something that you can't see. suddenly running around and playing with something that you can't see and having random bursts of energy, that maybe that's a sign that they're playing with fairies. Apparently, fairies really are drawn to animals and they love animals, so that could be a sign that there's a fairy close by, and a fairy possibly paying you a visit and your pets a visit. So if you've ever seen your cat, your dog, any of your animals running around chasing something, maybe they're running around after a fairy. Another sign could be having items moving around in your room, different things moving around in your house that you just can't seem to explain. Fairies are said to love small little items like decorations, clips for your hair, and different little trinkets and things like that. So that could be a sign that you have some fairies. Also, they say that if you hear taps at night or little scratches and different sounds that you can't pinpoint, that could also be the fairies. It's definitely fun to play around with the possibility of this. Those are just a couple of the signs that if you believe in fairies, that possibly you could have some close by. Just a few of the signs. Sometimes they don't always show themselves. Although I have read that in order to see any fairies or different beings like that, you do have to be open and you do have to kind of believe in the fairies. So if maybe you're not necessarily seeing anything like that, but some of those different experiences can be a sign that maybe fairies are visiting you. So I have heard of some people. They like to attract the friendly, good fairies to their home. They usually tend to bring good luck and good fortune. So I was reading up a little bit and I found some different things that you can do to attract good fairies to your home and into your life. So one of the major things and one of the main things that I was reading about fairies is that they absolutely love sweets and sugary things. So some people, they will leave out like offerings of cakes, they'll leave out bread, milk, honey, little candies and things like that. That's something that fairies are said to like and something that could possibly bring them closer to your home. There also have been said to really like different shiny items. They love crystals, stones, and also natural artifacts like seashells. They also really have been said to love bells and things that make sounds and music. So leaving out little items like that could also be an offering that you could leave out for the fairies. They said that probably the best place to leave out some kind of offering for a fairy would be either in your garden. Fairies, of course, they're said to be nature spirits, so for sure leaving them out in your garden could be a good way to attract them. Also, it's said that you can leave out these offerings in your home, and it can help to bring some of that good energy and the fairy spirits into your home, if that is something that you would be interested in trying. Of course, there's so many different things out there to learn about fairies. There's so many different books. I'm definitely going to reference a couple of fairy books in the description of this video if you guys would like to read a little bit more about that. So I've definitely just kind of scratched the surface about fairies with today's episode. There's so much more to learn. There's so many different types of fairy folk and different fairy creatures to learn about. So we talked mainly about the brownies, elves, pixies, the Holdu folk from the Icelandic culture, and the different fairies that have been described by the Cherokee tribe. That is really truly just scratching the surface because there's so much to learn. So yeah, I hope that you guys enjoyed the couple of stories that we discussed. Hopefully you learned a little bit about different fairies, and yeah, definitely fun to play around with the idea of something supernatural and kind of mystical and magical like fairies existing. And in honor of the fairies, I wanted to end today's episode with kind of a poem about fairies. and this is probably one of my favorites. I thought that it tied in really nicely with the topic of today's episode, and it is The Stolen Child by William Butler Yeats. Where dips the rocky highland of Sleuth Wood in the lake, there lies a leafy island where flapping herons wake. The drowsy water rats, there we've hid our fairy vats, full of berries and of reddest stolen cherries. Come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy, hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand. Where the wave of moonlight glosses the dim gray sands with light, far off by furthest Rosses, we foot it all the night, weavin' olden dances, mingling hands and mingling glances, till the moon has taken flight. To and fro we weep, and chase the frothy bubbles, while the world is full of troubles, and anxious in its sleep. Come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy, hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand. Where the wandering water gushes from the hills above Glen Car, in pools among the rushes that scarce could bathe a star, we seek for slumbering trout, and whispering in their ears, give them unquiet dreams, leaning softly out from ferns that drop their tears over the young streams. Come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy, hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand. Away with us he's gone, the solemn-eyed, he'll hear no more the lowing of the cows on the warm hillside, or the kettle on the hob sing peace into his breast, or see the brown mice bob round and round the oatmeal chest, for he comes, the human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy, hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than he can understand. Thank you guys so much for tuning into today's episode. I really hope that you enjoyed learning a little bit more about the fairy folk. If you guys have any interesting ghost stories, any supernatural experiences that you might like to share with me or have featured in a future episode, please don't hesitate to send them over to ghoststorycafe@gmail.com. Thank you.